Welcome back, everybody. And today we're going to be going over a political theory called constitutionalism. The focus question is going to be, how did the interplay between religious freedom, economic forces, and political structures shape the transition from absolutism to constitutionalism in England and the Dutch Republic during the early modern period? All right, so we're going to see that two countries in particular flout the overall move in much of Europe toward absolutist forms of government. All right, so last time we talked about France, Russia, Prussia, and Austria as nations who embraced this absolute paradigm, this absolute model of government. And in absolutism, the king has virtually unlimited authority. There is no check on his power. And this was in response to some of the chaos of the earlier centuries, as well as some new ideas, and economic forces also helped kings to elevate themselves to this new position of authority. Two countries, though, England and the Netherlands, are going to take things in another direction. All right? And again, there are factors behind this. So one of the things that distinguished both England and the Netherlands from some of the continental powers is that both of these nations gave a lot more authority to local government. They had a tradition of this. All right. And one of the reasons for this in the case of the Dutch is that they had actually just fought a war. So the Netherlands is actually a relatively new country by European standards. In the 1400s, the Netherlands had been part of Spain. All right, this was not uncommon for a monarch in one country to have territories in another country. And so the Netherlands, or the Low Countries as they're sometimes called, was actually a territory owned and administered by the Spanish crown. And for a variety of reasons, the Dutch fought a civil war against the Spanish. These reasons were primarily religious, but also cultural and linguistic. And anyways, the Dutch fought against this centralizing authority of Spain. And so when they emerged, they had had a bad experience with overly powerful kings. And one of the things that they did is they set up a decentralized form of government. And this was the case in England, too. In England, it wasn't so much that a foreign power had dominated the English, but during the Middle Ages, English kings were some of the first in Europe to begin to centralize their authority. And this prompted a pushback from powerful nobles during the Middle and Late Middle Ages. And what emerged out of this was a power-sharing agreement between the English king and some of the leading figures in the realm, both noble and non-noble leaders. And what emerged out of this was Parliament. All right? And Parliament is going to be a body of people, sort of like our Congress, and they're going to be made up of wealthy nobles and also going to be made up of powerful financial interests. All right? And so Parliament, a lot like the U.S. Congress, has two houses. In the U.S., it's the Senate and the House of Representatives. And in England, Parliament is made up of Lords, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. Now, the House of Commons may sound like it's kind of like sucky and low-born, and it is because it's not made up of nobles, but in British history, the House of Commons is actually going to become the more important, especially as finance and as the British Empire grows and as mercantile activity and money, as opposed to land, become important. And so a tradition develops early on in England that kings cannot tax unless they get the authority given to them by by Parliament. All right. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about the power struggle that emerges there. Another factor that set the Dutch and the English apart was commerce and urbanization. Now, all throughout the late Middle Ages, cities were growing all across Europe, and money was becoming more important. So it's not the case that England and the Netherlands were the only people with growing cities and big merchant populations. But in England and the Netherlands, cities and people who lived in cities made up a much larger percentage of the population. And merchants, relative to the power of nobles and the king, were much more wealthy in comparison. All right. So in the Dutch Republic, after getting independence from Spain, they set out and they began to trade. They'd always had this tradition of trade, and this became even more pivotal as they gained independence. Both the Netherlands and England are going to be among the first nations to begin to have overseas territories. They're going to start to develop colonies. These colonies are going to make some people wealthy. It's going to bring in a lot of money into the nation. Trade is going to be very important for both of these countries. Part of having a very vibrant economy means that cities are going to grow in both of these countries. Both of these countries, London, Amsterdam, they're going to have vibrant city centers. These city centers are going to have a lot of people who are literate. These people are going to talk about ideas. They're going to discuss new forms of government. All right. Whereas other countries, absolutist countries, tended to be more rural. They had maybe some cities. They had some merchants, but not to the degree that England and the Netherlands is going to have. All right. And so these merchants and these commercial actors are going to be among the first people who are going to challenge the authority of kings. All right. Another factor that played an important role was religion in both of these countries. So the Netherlands had just fought a war against Spain, which was a very Catholic country. And part of that, coming out of that, was the Dutch recognized that, some members of the Netherlands were going to be Catholic, but a lot of members of the Netherlands believed in different types of Protestantism. And if they wanted to keep their country together, they recognized that they were going to have to be religiously tolerant. All right. And so the Netherlands is going to be a country where religious toleration is going to be a very important cornerstone. And so any emphasis by kings or rulers to begin to impose any sort of religion is going to be met with some fierce pushback. In England, it's a little more complicated. In England, there also is pluralism. The crown, the English king, becomes Protestant under Henry VIII in the 1500s. But by the time we get to the 1600s, the period we're considering, England is also going to have a lot of different religions. So there's going to be the Church of England, which is the official church that the king has. There's going to be a Catholic minority. Catholicism becomes illegal, but there's still a lot of people who are going to continue to practice Catholicism. But another group are a group called the Puritans. And the Puritans are people who are very convinced of their religious faith, and they are going to seek to make the English church more Protestant. So the English church becomes Anglican. And essentially what happens is the king just replaces the Pope. They leave a lot of what had been Catholicism in place. And these Puritans are going to argue, no, that the English church needs to fully reform itself. It needs to break away from Catholicism more so. And so these were very important issues. As a matter of fact, they end up influencing the United States. As many of you know, some of the first people to come to Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New England in general were people who were fleeing for religious reasons. And a lot of these people were Puritans. All right. Okay. Finally, another factor that is going to be important is going to be the fact that both the English and the Dutch were primarily naval powers. Now, this may not seem like the most obvious reason for them not adopting absolute monarchy, but it kind of makes sense. So, in the case of France, or Russia, or Prussia, they lived on continental Europe. They had big borders that they needed to defend, and so they needed large armies. Large armies that would defend the country, large armies that were underneath the king, and large armies that the king could also use to suppress dissent within the countries. All right? So as long as a king had a reason to have a large army, he usually kept it, and often that army would not be just used to defend the borders, but could also be used to suppress people who were challenging the king. England is an island. It doesn't need to worry about a large army invading it. To be safe, England does need an army for internal control, but what's more important is a navy. England can defend itself with its navy. Navies are good for keeping people from coming to the island of England, but they're not good for suppressing internal dissent. In other words, the king doesn't have that big tool that he has in other countries to suppress people who would challenge him. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And the Netherlands is in a similar situation. They are on the continent, but the geography of the Netherlands is very watery, and the Dutch have ways of flooding their territory if they're ever threatened. And much more important for the Dutch is going to be their navy, because they're also on the ocean. And so again, the Dutch rulers don't have this option to use the army on their people like Louis XIV would. Okay, so what I want to talk about is how the English system of government comes about during this period of time, and why it doesn't go the route of absolutism, because many English kings would have liked to have had an absolute monarchy, right? I mean, if you're a powerful, wealthy, egotistical ruler, chances are you don't like people telling you no. I mean, this is pretty normal, right? Is that people, want more power and not less. And there were pressures in the 15 and 1600s for English kings to become absolute. Okay, so we're going to look at this kind of incident that breaks down. It's going to lead to the English Civil War. So the English Civil War is going to occur as a fight between the King of England at this time, a man by the name of Charles I, and the English Parliament. All right. Charles is going to come to the throne in the 1620s. This is a time when many other nations were doing away with things like their own parliaments. This is a time when Louis XIV and Louis XIII in France are emerging. They're becoming power players. In a short amount of time, the Russians and the Prussians are going to go absolute. So it's in the air. This is what countries are doing. The English Parliament was not crazy about these ideas. And in England, as I said, it was complicated by other factors. The king could rely on the English church having his back. All right, the king was technically the head of the Anglican church, or the English church. And so many of the powerful bishops and members of the church establishment were pro-king. Parliament, on the other hand, had the support of these Puritans that I mentioned. All right, and so many of these people who were very devout were backers of parliamentary power. They didn't want the king to become overly powerful, because if the king became overly powerful, then he would force the Anglican religion on them, which they weren't crazy about. They saw this as a threat to their way of worship. The other divide was that the king also had the support of the leading nobles, right? In a sense, the king was the biggest of the nobles, right? Many of these people had their power that dated back to the feudal era. And so many of these people were in Parliament themselves. They were members of the House of Lords. Remember, I said Parliament was divided between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And so many of the members of the House of Lords, even though they were in Parliament, they were attached to the old way of government. And many of them were pro-King Charles. The House of Commons, though, which is where the commercial, the mercantile, the kind of new money was, they tended to be pro-Parliament. And so these two forces, all throughout the 1600s, were kind of at each other's throats. Political tensions continued to mount until so these are some of the players. I had forgotten I had made these other slides. So the Anglican Church, you can see there, kind of the more Catholic looking, if you will. The Puritans are maybe more like what you would see looking at, an old New England picture. And then we had the landed aristocracy. These are people who have their wealth based on land. They tend to be wedded to the old system. And then the new commercial elite, who are going to back the House of Commons for the most part. Okay. Well, anyways, so this is kind of simmering all through the 1620s, the 1630s, and it really breaks out into open war in the 1640s. The king had increasingly decided to rule without Parliament. In other words, Parliament kept telling him no. The king wanted to raise taxes, and the Parliament said no. The Parliament was complaining about the king being too authoritarian. And so this was very annoying to the king, and so the king just decided he would try to rule without Parliament. After all, this is what absolutist monarchs did. No, Parliament couldn't do too much about it, but in 1642, the king was forced to call a Parliament. Why? Well, after ignoring them for 10 years, the king needed money because he had gotten into some trouble in another part of his realm. In the 1640s, Scotland and England had the same king, Charles, but they were still considered two different kingdoms at this time. They're now considered one kingdom, the United Kingdom. But at this time, Scotland and England were two nations that shared the same island. They had the same king, but they were still different nations. And the Scots were pretty angry at King Charles, and it was related to religion again. And they decided that they were just going to invade England to get to Charles, because they were so mad at him. King Charles, facing an invasion of England, now called the English Parliament and said, hey, we've got to get everybody together. We need to get money. And they said, well, why do you need money? And King Charles said, well, I've really upset the Scots. They don't like my religion. They don't like the fact that I'm acting like an absolutist. And the English Parliament said, yeah, neither do we, and we've been trying to tell you this right along. And they said, we'll give you money, but you're going to have to agree to everything that we tell you to do, which would have seriously limited Charles' power. Charles was not enthusiastic about this idea. He tried to arrest some members of Parliament for not going along with his plans, and this led to rebellion. Okay? And so some of the key players are going to be the royalists, people who are going to support the king, and the houses of the House of Commons in Parliament. All right. Now, this turns out the war in many ways turns on a few factors. One is enthusiasm. The Puritans, who are part of the parliamentary army, are very enthusiastic. They're very devout believers in God, and they think that God is on their side, and they believe that they're going to God wants them to purge England. Another thing that they have on their side is money, a lot of liquid money. Don't forget, Parliament has the backing of many financial people throughout the realm. And so these two factors, having these very devout, fearless soldiers and lots of liquid cash on hand, enables Parliament, with the help of their general, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is the man pictured here. It enables them to turn the tide on the king, and they start to defeat the king, and they eventually capture him, and he's eventually executed. All right, so King Charles is captured by Parliament. He's executed, and without a king, England becomes a republic for a period of time. Now, this doesn't do away with the problems, because everybody could agree that they didn't like King Charles, but once Charles was out of the way, the forces of Parliament disagreed among themselves. Some people wanted to continue with the reforms. They wanted to, make England maybe into a democracy of some sort. People with more wealth and more power said, well, we wanted to get rid of Charles, but no, we don't want that. And there were all kinds of religious craziness and religious ideas that came out of the woodwork, and it was a very chaotic time that England lived through for about 11 years in between the beheading of Charles and this period of time when there was no king. And this is during the time when Oliver Cromwell was exercising more and more power. So he almost, as England devolves into chaos, he almost becomes a dictator himself. Okay. Well, this situation doesn't last forever, though, because in 1558, Oliver Cromwell dies. And there's really nobody to take his place. There isn't, he has a son, but his son isn't up for the job, and the British are really left wondering what they're going to do. And so one of the thoughts that occurs to them is, what if we bring back King Charles? Now you may be saying, well, wait a minute, King Charles doesn't have a head anymore. He's been dead. That's true, but he has a son also named King Charles. Well, also named Charles, and he had to flee to France during this period of time when England was a republic. But the British ask him to come back. They say, "Hey Charles, we're really sorry about killing your dad. We'd like you to be our king again." And King Charles agrees. In 1660, he comes back to England, and he's a bit of a hero. And, the English warn him. They say, listen, we're inviting you back, but we don't want you to act like your father. A couple of things we've got to be clear is you have to work with Parliament. We don't want you bringing any sort of absolutism into the country. We want you to behave yourself. Oh, and really importantly, we don't want you to be Catholic. We don't want Catholics. A lot of the people in England were Puritans by this time. And so as long as Charles agreed to this, everything was fine, and he did. And he seemed to have had a pretty happy reign. He was happy to be king. Charles liked to womanize and to drink, and, you know, his budget and opportunities were much larger than they had been. Unfortunately, though, Charles has lots and lots of kids, but none of them are with his actual wife. So when he dies, England has another crisis. But it's okay, because Charles has a brother. And his brother is named James. James II. Unfortunately for James, James is not like his brother. He's not too fun. He's not a big womanizer, which was fine, except that he also was a lot more serious. And he was very serious about bringing absolutism to England. And unfortunately, from the British perspective, he also had another big problem. Not only was he attracted to absolutism, but he was also a very devout Catholic and very open about it. And as soon as he came to power, not only did he start to bring absolutist policies, but he also started to make and take steps to make Britain a Catholic country again. And this in doing so, he really upset everybody. He upset Parliament because, Parliament was going to, was facing the threat of absolutism again. He threatened the Puritans. His absolutism was threatening to merchants who didn't feel like their wealth was secure. And so basically James II managed to piss everybody off. And so shortly after becoming king, he had so alienated people that people began to look around for a replacement. Obviously not openly. It would have been dangerous to do so, but the British Parliament began to look around Europe to see if they could get a replacement for him. And they found one. They found a guy from the Netherlands named William of Orange. He had all the right criteria. He was Protestant. He was kind of a relatively unimportant royal person. He had some connections by blood to the British royal line. And most importantly, he was someone that they felt that they could control. What they didn't want to do again was overthrow Charles and have a situation where there was chaos. They wanted a king, but they wanted a king that they could deal with. And so they wrote a letter to William in the Netherlands, and they said, hey, would you consider, please, invading us? This is probably the only time in history that people actually invited another group of people to invade them. And so he did. William came, he invaded England, and we'll put invade in air quotes because there wasn't really much resistance to him. James II was that unpopular. James was wiser than his father had been, Charles I. James saw the handwriting on the wall, and he didn't stick around to fight. He fled to France. He abdicated his throne in a sense. I mean, he didn't officially resign, but he didn't stick around to get his head cut off like his father had. And so this invasion became known as the Glorious Revolution. And it was glorious for a couple of reasons. One was because almost nobody died in it. Like, nobody was willing to put themselves out there for James. So it was a bloodless revolution. And from the perspective of the British ruling class, Parliament, it was glorious because they kind of got what they wanted. They got a king that they could control, and they got rid of the guy who was causing them problems without much fuss. All right. Well, before they handed William and his wife Mary, that's where we get the name William and Mary College, if you're familiar with that. Before they handed him the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, they said, well, listen, I know you're telling us now you're going to behave yourself, but we just want to be extra sure that you're going to do so. we need you to sign this document. And this document that they had him sign became known as the Bill of Rights. This was the English Bill of Rights. It was signed in 1689. And the English Bill of Rights essentially is going to be a constitution for Britain. It's going to be added to earlier documents that are going to limit the power of the king. Okay, so part of the Bill of Rights, like the American Bill of Rights, which is based on the English Bill of Rights, is that there are civil liberties that are guaranteed. What are civil liberties? They're personal freedoms that you're guaranteed by law. Like what? Well, like freedom of speech, freedom of the press. These were important according to the English revolutionaries because, well, when King Charles I and when James II was there, you didn't have the right to criticize the government. And these people felt that this was a fundamental right. You know, you need to be able to speak truth to power. So you need to be able to assemble, you need to protest, you need to be able to write and communicate these ideas. And so that was part of it. Also, a right to bear arms. Now, this wasn't for hunting purposes. The idea is that if everybody was armed, then kings wouldn't be able to impose their will on their subjects without fear. And so part of it was having an armed populace. And there were several others, you know, rights that you didn't have to take in soldiers, it's called quartering, and a bunch of other things. The Bill of Rights also stipulated that the king was going to be subject to the law like everybody else. In other words, the king was going to be under the law. In an absolutist country, the king is the law. He makes the law. What he says is the law. But in what became known as a constitutional monarchy, the Constitution is above the king. The king has to follow the laws of the government. And in the British case, this was going to mean that the king had to give up some of his powers. The power to tax, that was going to be for Parliament. The power to make laws on his own. This was he's going to have to work in conjunction with Parliament. The ability to raise an army. Naturally, people were afraid after their experiences with earlier monarchs to give the king the exclusive power to raise an army. And so that was also going to be under parliamentary control. All right. And so this whole thing, this Bill of Rights, the Glorious Revolution, was an important milestone. Now, I want to briefly just talk a little bit about the Dutch because they're also a constitutional republic. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but this period of time became known as the Dutch Golden Age. Once, as I mentioned, once they had revolted against Spain, once they got their independence, the Dutch went on a period of trade, of exploration. They seized some of the colonies of earlier empires like Spain and Portugal. And it was a very innovative time for them. In the Netherlands, which is also sometimes known as the United Provinces, it's called the United Provinces because there was a lot of decentralized control under the authority of merchants and other folks. All right, so something similar to the British Parliament, I guess you could call it. The Dutch also had some pretty big ideas. The Dutch, as I mentioned, were religiously tolerant, and their ideas of tolerance became widespread. They also became big believers in having a free press, and so the Netherlands is going to be a place that people go to publish. And so there's going to be a lot of ideas. They're also going to produce some famous thinkers that are going to help articulate some of these ideas of freedom and so on. All right. And so both the English and the Netherlands are going to make some important contributions. And some of these ideas are going to have very, very big effects. One thinker in particular, John Locke, who was from England and actually lived through this whole period of time, wrote some really important documents. John Locke came up with an idea called social contract theory. And basically, his idea is that governments don't rule because God put the king there. This is what absolutist monarchs argued. But rather that governments, whether they be kings or parliaments or anybody else, is there because they are doing something useful. They're there because the people wanted to put them there, at least originally. All right, and this became known as contract theory, is that people, yes, people are willing to give up some of their powers, right? I don't take the law into my own hands. I'm willing to yield some of that to the government. I don't try to build roads myself. I'm willing to pay taxes to the government, but the government is there and serves me as a citizen and other citizens. All right? And so the social contract says the government isn't there for the people in power, but that it should be mutually beneficial to the governed and the people governing. All right? A really important idea in Locke's political theory is natural rights. Locke emphasized the idea that all people have certain inalienable rights. The right to life, liberty. And I can almost hear you all saying, and the pursuit of happiness. No. According to Locke, it was life, liberty, and property, private property. All right. Now, obviously, Locke's ideas you've heard before, and it's because they're in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson basically plagiarized John Locke. He just changed the last thing from property to the pursuit of happiness. If he was in my class, I would still nail him for plagiarism, even though he changed one word. Right? So anyways, these ideas are going to become very important in England and the Netherlands, but also in the United States and even in other parts of Europe. All right? And so there's going to be some big influences, right? It's going to shape many modern ideas that most countries in Europe and North America and even in other places are going to embrace. Their big reverberations in the immediate term are going to be first in the American Constitution, which is going to happen, about 100 years after the time of John Locke, but also the French Revolution, which is going to happen in 1789, a few years after the American Revolution, in which, in many ways, this is going to have a much bigger impact on Europe because it's such a central country in Europe. And so these ideas that come out of the Dutch Republic and the English Civil War are going to challenge absolutism. It's going to be an alternate model. All right? All right. Well, hopefully this makes constitutionalism clearer and you can see that it's a different system than absolutism. And they're both going to be important going forward. So, what I'd like you to do is to answer this question. How did the interplay between religious freedom, economic forces, and political structures shape the transition from absolutism to constitutionalism in England and the Dutch Republic during the early modern period?